Welcome back. If you're new here, this channel is dedicated to first-person accounts from people who work in remote terrain rangers, contractors, search and rescue volunteers, field biologists, surveyors, fire lookouts, people who spend serious time in the backcountry and who occasionally encounter things that their training and their experience don't cover. Not hikers who got scared on a popular trail. People whose jobs put them in places most people never reach, and who came back with accounts that I believe deserve to be heard clearly and without dramatization. Tonight's collection comes out of the Appalachian Range, 5 accounts from 5 different states, 5 different professions, 5 different encounters with something that these mountains have apparently been holding for a very long time. I'll be with you for the next few hours. Get comfortable. The accounts speak for themselves. I spent 4 hours calling Ray's name into that hollow before I found him. He was alive. He was fine. The problem is he'd been unconscious since 2 in the afternoon. Whatever I'd been talking to out there in the dark for 4 hours wasn't Ray. I've been a volunteer trail crew member with the Glenwood and Newcastle Ranger District for 12 years. That covers a stretch of the Appalachian Trail through the Jefferson National Forest in southwest Virginia, roughly 90 miles of trail between the Tennessee state line and the James River corridor. I go out 6, sometimes 7 times a year, weekend trips mostly, occasionally a full week in May or September when I can arrange the time away from work. The job is physical and unglamorous. Chainsaws, loppers, rock bars, drain dips, log water bars, shelter maintenance. You go in, the trail is eroded and overgrown and the shelter roof is leaking. You come out, it isn't. That's the whole transaction, and for 12 years, it's been enough for me. Ray Holt has been my regular crew partner for 8 of those 12 years. We met through the volunteer coordination system and fell into a working rhythm the way 2 people do when their pace and their tolerance for discomfort align without discussion. Ray is 54, retired after 31 years with a regional telephone company, built like someone who spent those 3 decades climbing poles and pulling cable in all weather. He is methodical in a way that goes beyond habit. It's closer to philosophy. He checks everything twice. He carries the same tools in the same pockets on every trip so that his hand finds what he needs without looking. He has developed opinions about knot types and drainage slopes and rock bar leverage angles that he will explain at length if you give him the opening. He is not a dramatic person. He does not exaggerate. He does not panic. 8 years working beside Ray in weather that ranges from pleasant to genuinely dangerous, I have never once seen him rattled. That's not a small thing. Some people stay calm by not processing what they're seeing. Ray stays calm because he processes it fully and decides the most useful next action. There's a difference, and you learn to tell it after long enough. The trip in late October of 2022 was our 4th winterization run at the shelter. I'm going to call the Laurel Creek Shelter. That's not its formal name. I'm going to leave the formal name out of this because the shelter is still an active structure and still sees regular hiker traffic, and I'm not interested in directing the wrong kind of attention toward it. What I can tell you is that it sits in the Jefferson at an elevation of roughly 3,200 feet on a ridge that forms the eastern wall of a narrow hollow. The hollow drops steeply below the shelter, 200 yards of slope from the flat shelf where the structure sits down to Laurel Creek, which runs along the hollow bottom year-round over sandstone bedrock. The shelter is a standard 3-sided Appalachian Trail design, stone walls on 3 sides, log and metal roof, sleeping platform sized for 4 to 5 hikers, open front facing south, across a small clearing. The clearing holds a fire ring, a bear box bolted to a hemlock, and the trailhead of a narrow-use trail that switchbacks down the hollow wall to the water source. The hollow below the shelter has a particular acoustic quality that I noticed the first time we worked this site. The walls of it focus sound upward. A voice at the creek level carries clearly to the shelter platform, sometimes more clearly than you'd expect given the distance and the slope. I had attributed it to the topography, narrow, hollow, hard stone walls, the particular angle of the slopes, and thought nothing more about it. That understanding would cost me later. We drove Ray's truck up the Forest Service access road to the gate, parked, and hiked the 1.25 miles of approach trail to the shelter. We were in by noon. The weather was what late October gives you in the Virginia mountains, when the front has already come through and left the sky clear but cold upper 30s. A light northwest wind working through the bare hardwood canopy, the kind of dry cold that makes your breath visible and your fingers stiff in the first hour. The leaves were down in the upper hollow. The forest was open and gray, every branch and rock and slope visible through the bare canopy in a way that summer growth never allows. I like the October forest for that reason. It's honest. It shows you the land's actual structure without any decorative concealment. We dropped packs on the shelter platform and checked the register before starting work. The register is a standard composition notebook in a gallon Ziploc, hung from a nail on the interior wall. We check it on every crew visit. It tells us what conditions hikers have been finding, what maintenance issues have come up, what the water source is doing. It's the shelter's institutional memory, written in the handwriting of everyone who has spent a night under that roof and taken the time to document it. The last crew entry was 6 weeks prior, from a 2-person team who had done a blowdown clearing on the approach trail and noted the shelter was in good structural condition. After that, 7 weeks of hiker entries. I flipped through them in reverse chronological order, starting from the most recent. The first unusual entry was 4 weeks back. Blue ink, clear block lettering, the handwriting of someone who wanted legibility. It said, "Water source good, filtered without issue. Do not go to the creek after dark. Heard something calling my name from the hollow last night. Voice sounded exactly like my hiking partner. He was asleep next to me the whole time. Did not respond to it. Kept watching the open front of the shelter until light." I read it twice. Set it in the back of my mind with the category label of things that might become relevant later. Not alarmed, not dismissive, just noted. 3 days after that entry, a different writer. Looser handwriting. The slightly cramped script of someone who writes fast. Something in this hollow at night. Heard what I can only describe as a full conversation between 2 people below the shelter starting around midnight. No other hikers present. Voices kept using my name and my partner Gabe's name specifically. Gabe was beside me the whole time. We did not respond and did not sleep. Left at first light. I do not know what is down there. I do not want to know. A week after that, a third entry, this one longer, written in the measured prose of someone who had thought carefully about what they wanted to document. It said, "This is my 3rd visit to this shelter over the past 5 weeks, all solo trips. On each visit I have heard the voice from the hollow. It has learned more each time. First visit, it called generic sounds something like a person in distress in distinct words. Second visit, it used my first name. Third visit, last night, it used my full name, first and last, correctly pronounced. I have not written my name in full in any trail register on this trail. I do not know how it has access to this information. Do not engage with voices from the hollow. Do not respond. Do not go down." The remaining entries were variations shorter, more urgent, all carrying the same essential warning. One hiker wrote only 4 words, "It knows your name." Another wrote, "Left at 3 a.m, could not wait for dawn, recommend skipping this shelter entirely." I showed all of them to Ray. He read each one, returned the register to me, and said what he always says when something doesn't slot neatly into an existing category. "Huh." Then he picked up his rock bar and went to assess the drainage ditch behind the shelter. "That is Ray." "Huh." And back to work. I followed his lead. We worked through the afternoon in the way we always do, methodical, sequential, one task completed before the next one starts. Platform board inspection. 2 boards on the south end were showing rot and needed sistering with new stock. Drainage ditch behind the shelter, partially silted in, needed clearing for about 15 feet. Interior wall assessment. 2 stones loose in the east wall's second course, needed repointing. Privy, roof intact, seat cracked, needed replacement. Bare box, hinges functional, latch stiff, needed greasing. We worked through the list with the efficiency of people who have done this specific work at this specific shelter before and who know where the problems tend to accumulate. The light in the hollow was already going at 3 in the afternoon. That's the thing about a narrow hollow facing east. You lose direct sun early, sometimes hours before actual sunset, and the temperature drops fast once that happens. I had noted it on previous trips, and we'd planned accordingly, expecting to have the critical work done by 3:30 and the camp established before 4. Around 2 in the afternoon, Ray said he was going down to check the water source. Standard part of the winterization assessment, we log the creek flow rate, test for turbidity, check the use trail for erosion, and clear any debris that's blocking the natural drainage. He took the water testing kit out of his pack, clipped his headlamp to his hat brim even though it was still light enough not to need it, grabbed his trekking poles, and started down the switchback use trail. I watched him for about 30 seconds until the slope swallowed him and the trail turned and he was gone into the hollow. I went back to the platform boards, got the first replacement board cut, and sistered in, started on the second. The sounds of the hollow were the sounds I knew from previous trips, the distant, constant murmur of Laurel Creek at the bottom, the wind working through the upper canopy above the hollow walls, the occasional knock of a dead branch, normal sounds, background sounds, the kind that become invisible after 30 minutes. Then Ray called up from the hollow. His voice carried the way I knew it would. Focused up the hollow walls, arriving at the shelter level with more clarity than you'd expect from 200 yards of slope. He shouted that he'd left the secondary filter housing in the truck center console and asked if I'd brought the spare from my pack. I told him I hadn't, that mine was in my pack at home. I'd meant to grab it and forgotten. He said, no problem, the primary was working fine, the flow looked good, he'd finish up the turbidity check and the use trail assessment and be back up. That was Ray. That was completely, unremarkably Ray. I went back to the platform boards. 20 minutes passed. Then another 20. I finished the platform boards and moved to the drainage ditch and worked through it and finished that too. And by then the light in the hollow had moved from gray to the particular flat darkness of a clouded over late afternoon in a forested depression. The sky, above the ridge line, still showing some luminance, but none of it reaching the hollow floor. Ray called up again. He said he was seeing significant erosion on the lower 2 switchbacks of the use trail, worse than last year, he thought, maybe a foot of tread loss in one section. Asked if I could bring down the extra drainage rake so he could flag the worst spots with some stick markers for the report. The rake was leaning against the shelter's east wall. I picked it up, got to the top of the use trail, and stopped. I don't know exactly what stopped me. It wasn't a specific thought. It was something more physical than that, a kind of resistance, like a hand on my chest, that my body produced before my brain had finished reviewing whatever my brain was reviewing. I stood at the top of the switchback with the rake in my hand and the hollow yawning below me, and I called down instead. I asked him how cold the water was testing. A pause. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Long for Ray, who answers simple questions without any lag. Then, cold, real cold, like always. Correct answer. The creek runs consistently cold at that elevation, year-round, typically between 36 and 42 degrees. He'd said the right thing. But the pause was wrong. Ray doesn't pause on simple questions. Ray processes and responds. The hesitation didn't fit the person I'd been working beside for 8 years. I called down again. I asked him what the flow rate was looking like, above normal, below, about right for October. This pause was longer. 5 seconds, maybe 6. Then, it's good. Come on down and I'll show you on the test kit. Better if you see it. Come on down. He says that phrase often enough that I can hear it in his particular rhythm even without sound. The slight drop on down, the mild impatience and better if you see it. This had that rhythm. It sounded like him. But it had told me to come look rather than giving me a number, and Ray gives numbers. Ray says the flow rate is running high, maybe 30% above the October average from the look of the rocks. Ray doesn't say, come see. I set the rake against the shelter wall. I walked to the clearing edge and called his name at full voice, projecting clearly down into the hollow. Not a shout, a carrying call. The kind you use when you want to be sure someone at a distance has actually heard you. No response for about 15 seconds. Then, from below, from further left than before, further toward the creek bend, his voice. "Stop calling. I can hear you fine." I said, "I am almost done." Stop calling. Ray has never said that to me in 8 years. Ray has never once told me to stop anything in a way that didn't have a specific operational reason attached to it. Stop calling. I can hear you fine is the answer of something that doesn't want to keep responding to its name. That's the answer of something that's been performing and is tiring of the performance or doesn't understand why I keep triggering it. I stood at the clearing edge and I thought carefully about what to do next. The rational part of my mind was still running the normal explanations. The hollow distorts sound. Ray is frustrated, he's cold and tired, and wants to finish the assessment without interruptions. Those explanations were available, and they were not nothing. But they were fighting against the sum of what I'd been accumulating. The pause on the temperature question, the come see it instead of a number, the stop calling, and now the shift in position. He had been below the shelter when I last heard him, directly below, and now the voice was coming from much further left, near the creek bend, which was at least another 60 yards from the primary water source where he would have been working. I asked him one more question. I called down and asked him which section of the use trail was showing the worst erosion, the upper switchbacks or the lower section near the creek. The pause this time was longer than any of the others. 7 seconds, maybe 8. Long enough that I had started to believe there would be no answer. Then, lower section, near the water. "Come on down, I'll show you." Ray told me on the drive-in that the upper switchbacks were the section he'd been worried about from last year's assessment. He'd specifically said, while we were still in the truck on the access road, that he expected to find significant tread loss on the upper portion where the slope angle was steepest. He had not mentioned the lower section, and whatever was in that hollow had guessed wrong. It was done performing. I was done pretending I didn't know. I walked to the clearing edge and called his name at full voice, projecting clearly down into the hollow. Not a shout, a carrying call. The kind you use when you want to be sure someone at a distance has actually heard you. The light was almost gone from the hollow by then. The sky above the ridgeline had dropped to a deep gray purple, and below the shelter shelf the hollow was already fully dark, the hemlock on the lower slopes absorbing the last of the ambient light. Ray had been down there since 2. It was now approaching 4:30, closing on 5. I got my headlamp, I got my bear spray, I got the emergency blanket from the bottom of my pack and put it in my jacket pocket, and I went down. The used trail switchbacks were steep and rocky in the upper section, and I took them carefully, 1 foot at a time, my headlamp throwing good light, but the angle of the slope creating shadows that shifted with each step. The hollow walls rose on both sides as I descended, the hardwood canopy giving way to hemlock as the trail leveled toward the bottom, the air temperature dropping noticeably with every 20 feet of elevation I lost. Cold air drains into hollow bottoms and pools there, and by the time I reached the lower section of the trail, I could feel it on my face and hands like cold water. The smell changed too, as I got lower from the dry leaf and cold stone smell of the upper slope to something wetter and more organic. The smell of creek mud and wet hemlock root, and the particular mineral dampness of water-carved sandstone, a normal hollow smell, the smell I remembered from the 3 previous trips down this trail. I noted it because noting normal things was useful. It helped me hold the framework of ordinary experience against whatever was happening around me. I was smelling a normal Appalachian hollow in October. That was something. What had changed was the acoustic environment. The hollow had gone quiet in a way I hadn't registered until I was most of the way down. The creek sound was still there, the constant rush of water over stone, but the background sounds of the forest had stopped. No wind in the upper canopy, no small animals in the leaf litter, no birds from the ridge line. The hollow had gone to that particular silence the woods produce, when everything that was making sound has decided at once to stop making it. I have heard that silence before on other trips in other terrain, usually before weather, sometimes for no reason I can identify. It always makes the skin on the back of my neck do something involuntary. It did it now. The voice called 3 times during my descent. Once from below, ahead of me, the direction. I was already moving Ray's voice, asking what was taking so long. Once from behind me and above, back up the slope, asking me to come back up and get the rake after all. The 3rd time from directly to my right, from the hollow wall, not from the trail at all, from a position that would have required someone to be standing on a 40-degree slope in the dark for no reason. I did not answer any of them. I kept moving toward the creek. I found Ray 8 feet from the water's edge, lying on his left side in the leaf litter and moss of the creek bank, his trekking poles still in his hands, both straps around his wrists, his headlamp still on his head and still burning, the beam pointing sideways into the face of a creek boulder, at a downward angle that suggested he'd been lying here long enough for the lamp to have shifted from wherever it had been pointing when he went down. His filter setup was assembled on the flat rock nearest the water intake tube submerged. Body assembled, output tube in his water bottle, but the bottle cap was off and the filter hadn't been run. He'd started the setup and then he'd gone down, and nothing had been touched since. His breathing was steady when I got my hand to his neck. Pulse was present, slightly slow. Skin on his face and hands was cold in a way that had nothing to do with the ambient temperature. It was the deep cold of someone who has been in contact with cold ground for an extended period, the body having already allocated heat away from the extremities to protect the core. His lips were not blue, which I took as a meaningful sign, but he was out completely, no response to my voice, no response to my hand on his shoulder. Just the slow, slightly ragged breathing of a man in a light hypothermic state on a cold creek bank. I got the emergency blanket out of my pocket, unfolded it, and got it around him. Got my pack off and used it to elevate his feet slightly, the way the wilderness first aid course teaches. Talked to him steadily, his name, my name, where we were, that I had him, that we were going to move soon. The voice, the way a familiar presence is a voice, not because he could process the words, but because the sound of someone who knows you is a physiological signal, and the body responds to it even when the brain is offline. It took about 4 minutes before his eyes opened, another 2 before they started tracking. He looked at me the way people look when they're coming up from unconsciousness in a cold and dark place, with a particular blankness of a mind that hasn't yet assembled a timeline. He said my name as a question. I said, "Yeah, I'm here. We're going up." He said, "Why are we down here?" I told him he'd come down to check the water source. He said it was dark. I said yes. He said he didn't remember it getting dark. I said, "I know." I got him sitting, then standing, the emergency blanket still around his shoulders. He was unsteady, but he was on his feet, and he was talking, and he was present. We left his gear at the creek filter, kit, poles, all of it. I'd come back for it in daylight. The only priority was getting him up that slope and away from the hollow bottom. That was when the voice started from above us. From the upper hollow wall, somewhere in the hemlock canopy above where the used trail cut down, my name called in Ray's voice. The exact register, the exact inflection, the exact way he has said my name probably 10,000 times over 8 years of working together, asking what was taking so long, asking me to come back up. Ray was standing next to me with my hand under his arm. He was looking in the direction the voice was coming from with an expression I have never seen on his face before and have not seen since, not fear exactly, but the look of a man encountering something that violates a deeply held understanding of how the world is organized. He said, very quietly, "That's not me." I said, "I know." I said, "Let's move." We went up the trail slowly. Ray managed his own feet, but needed the contact of my arm the entire way. The voice called 4 more times during the ascent, twice from above us, once from directly to our left on the hollow wall, once from below, back where we'd come from. Each call used my name, or Ray's name, or both, asked us to come back, said it was almost done, said just a minute more. Patient, not frantic. Patient the way something is patient when it has been waiting in the same hollow for longer than we would want to imagine, and when 2 people failing to come to it is not a failure but a delay. We cleared the top of the used trail and came back onto the shelter shelf. I got the stove going and got Ray sitting on the platform with his back against the wall and hot water going into him. I gave it 8 minutes, enough to get something warm into his core, not enough to let the dark settle any further around us. Then I broke camp. Everything into packs in under 12 minutes. Headlamps on, we moved. The approach trail back to the trailhead was 1.25 miles of easy grade, and we did it without stopping. Ray's legs came back under him fully by the half-mile mark. We didn't talk much. The forest on both sides was October night, quiet bare trees, cold air, the sound of our boots on the trail. At the footbridge over the tributary creek, 1/4 mile from the shelter, I stopped. I don't know why I stopped. I turned around and put my headlamp back down the trail. Empty. Dark trees, dark ground, the beam cutting out to maybe 40 yards. From back in that darkness, past the edge of the light, my name. Once, Ray's voice. Then nothing. We crossed the bridge. I did not stop. Again. Ray spent 2 nights at Carillion New River Valley Medical Center in Christiansburg. The diagnosis was mild hypothermia and a vasovagal syncopal episode. The attending physician's working theory was that Ray had been crouched over the filter setup in cold temperatures, had gotten his core temperature down further than he'd realized, had stood up too fast, and had fainted. The body sometimes just does that when you've been cold enough for long enough. His blood work came back clean. His imaging came back clean. He went home on the 3rd day and was back to normal within a week. He has not talked to me directly about what he heard on the hollow wall that night. Not in any specific way. He mentioned it once, about 2 months later, as we were driving to a different crew site on the Northern District entirely without preamble, staring at the road, his hands in the same position on the wheel they're always in. He said he didn't think the explanation they gave at the hospital was right, and then he didn't say anything else and I didn't push it. That's the only time. We have worked 11 crew trips since. He is the same Ray he has always been. Methodical, twice checking, tying knots correctly, clearing the drain dip to the full specified depth. He just doesn't talk about the hollow. Neither do I. We have, without discussing it, agreed that the box it lives in is closed, and that we can still do the work without opening it. That is enough for both of us. I filed the incident under Jefferson National Forest District Maintenance Report, JNF-1782, dated November of 2022. The report described a volunteer crew member medical event at the water source resulting in a welfare check and early extraction. The unusual auditory phenomena received 2 sentences and were attributed to unknown cause, possible acoustic distortion produced by the hollow's topography. The district ranger called me the following week. I gave her the longer version. She listened and was quiet for a moment and said she'd pull the register for review. She did not tell me what the review found. The shelter remains in service. I have winterized 7 other shelters since. I will keep going. The work is worth doing, and this trail needs people willing to do it. But I carry the rule with me on every trip now, and I'm putting it here for anyone who does this kind of work or hikes solo in hollow terrain in the Jefferson or anywhere like it. But I do it with a rule now that I did not have before, and I'm passing it to anyone who uses these shelters or does this kind of crew work in hollow terrain. The rule is simple. If your partner goes to the water source alone and you lose visual contact, you give them 20 minutes, not 30, 20. If they're not back up that slope in 20 minutes, you go after them immediately, in whatever light remains, before the hollow goes dark. You do not wait for them to call you. You do not wait to see if they come back on their own. You go. And if you hear their voice calling from somewhere they shouldn't be able to call from the wrong side of the slope, from further than they've had time to travel, from the hollow wall rather than the trail, you do not answer. You do not call back. You do not go toward it. You get to high ground. You cross running water if there's running water between you and it, and you wait for morning. Whatever is in that hollow knows your partner's voice. It has had a long time to practice, and it will keep you talking long enough to forget to check whether the person talking back is the one who went down in the first place. I pulled Ricky out of that drainage by her wrists. Whatever had her ankles let go. I don't know why it let go. I think about that every single day. I've been a volunteer with Blount County Mountain Rescue for 8 years. Based out of Maryville, Tennessee, we cover the southern flank of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, a territory that includes some of the most trafficked and some of the most technical terrain on the eastern seaboard. In 8 years, I've worked close to 90 callouts, day hiker medical evacs, technical rope rescues off the cliff bands above Alum Cave, lost child searches in the Chimney Tops area, recovery operations on the Ramsey Cascades Trail. I've done the work in rain and in snow and in the August heat that the deep hollows of the Smokies hold like a wet fist. I've found people alive, and I've found people not alive, and I've found gear belonging to people who were never found at all. The Smokies are unlike any other terrain I've worked. The park sits at the convergence of weather systems from the Gulf and the Atlantic, which means the weather can shift from passable to dangerous in the span of a radio check-in cycle. The forest below 4,000 feet is some of the densest in the eastern United States, rhododendron and hemlock, so thick in the drainage systems that visibility drops to 10 feet and navigation requires a compass and count pacing because landmarks disappear inside the vegetation. The park receives more visitors than any other national park in the country, which means a steady supply of people who underestimate what they're walking into, who overestimate their fitness, who lose the trail in a fog that descends in 20 minutes from a clear sky, who follow drainages downhill because that feels logical and end up in terrain they cannot climb out of. The work is real, and it matters, and it requires people who understand the difference between what they think they know and what the mountain is actually showing them. I'm telling you this so you understand what I mean when I say that what happened in the Haw Branch drainage on the third day of the Lily Crow search is something I've processed through every framework I have, and that none of them close the file. Lily Crow was 9 years old. She disappeared on a Saturday morning in late October during a family hike on the Alum Cave Trail, which runs from the Newfound Gap Road trailhead up to the Alum Cave Bluffs and beyond. The Crow family, father, mother, Lily, and a 7-year-old brother had started the hike at 9 in the morning under overcast skies. At some point between the Arch Rock Formation and the Alum Cave Bluffs, the family stopped to rest at a creek crossing. When the father looked up from the map, Lily was not there. He searched the immediate area for 20 minutes before calling the Park Service. By the time the initial search team reached the trailhead, 1.5 hours had passed since last contact. I was called in on day 2. By then, the search had expanded from the primary trail corridor to the surrounding terrain, divided into grid sectors that Search Command was assigning in priority order based on probability of location modeling and terrain analysis. I was paired with Ricky Bowen, who has been on the rescue team 3 years and who I've worked with on 4 previous searches. Ricky is thorough and physically capable on steep terrain, and she communicates clearly under pressure. In a grid search, those are the qualities that matter. Our sector on day 2 was the ridgeline above the primary trail, east-facing slopes between 2,800 and 3,400 feet elevation. We covered our grid and found nothing relevant. Some deer sign, an old fire ring from before the park's camping restrictions, one boot print in a muddy drainage that the dog team subsequently determined was at least 4 days old and not a match for Lily's shoe size. We checked in at Search Command at 6 in the evening with a negative report and drove back to Maryville. Day 3, our sector shifted. Search Command had received a field recommendation from one of the dog teams suggesting the drainage system below the primary trail might warrant further attention. The dogs had shown interest in the top of the Haw Branch drainage, a steep, hemlock-choked gully that ran down the mountain's south face below the Arch Rock section of the trail. The Haw Branch drainage is not a maintained trail and is not a route that hikers use. It's a rugged, heavily vegetated drainage that drops sharply off the trail corridor and runs down through hemlock and rhododendron for almost a mile before it flattens out near a forest road at the mountain's base. It is exactly the kind of terrain a disoriented child might have stumbled into, and exactly the kind of terrain that would have made it difficult for that child to find their way back out. We were at the sector boundary by 7:30 in the morning. The weather had gone from overcast to active, a cold rain moving in from the northwest, temperatures in the mid-30s. The kind of weather that the search management team would have preferred to keep searchers out of, but couldn't justify given the time elapsed since Lily's disappearance. Hypothermia was a genuine operational concern by day 3. A 9-year-old, 3 nights, temperatures in the 30s, we all understood what the math looked like. We rigged for the terrain, technical packs, rope gear, helmets, crampons in case the trail iced up, radios on and checked before we stepped off the maintained trail. Ricky took point going into the drainage. I had the radio and the paper map and a full first aid kit, in addition to the standard SAR load. We ate breakfast in the truck before we stepped off. That sounds incidental, but it matters in the account because it was the last completely normal thing that happened. Ricky had a thermos of coffee. I had a gas station sandwich that I didn't finish. We went over the sector map one more time and confirmed our radio check-in schedule every 30 minutes on the hour and half hour, regardless of contact status, with a mandatory voice confirmation rather than a squelch break, so Search Command could assess our condition from the audio. Standard protocol for drainage work. When you're below grade in a hemlock drainage in the Smokies, your radio signal degrades and your ability to self-rescue if something goes wrong degrades with it. The check-in schedule is the rope that keeps you connected to the operation. The Haw Branch drainage entered steeply from the first step off the maintained trail. The hemlock on the upper walls was dense enough that it reduced the gray morning to a kind of permanent twilight even at 8 in the morning. The canopy knitting together overhead into a ceiling that the rain penetrated only in individual drops through the gaps. The ground was wet shale and root networks and moss-covered sandstone, the kind of footing that demands full attention on every step. The grade dropped maybe 400 feet in the first quarter mile, steep enough that you go down sideways, putting weight on the uphill foot with each step. We worked down in stages, calling Lily's name at standard search volume loud enough to carry but controlled enough to preserve voice. Standard protocol. Between calls we listened. The drainage returned the sound of moving water from somewhere below and the particular muffled quality of rain on hemlock needles, nothing else. We were about 20 minutes into the drainage when Ricky stopped and put her fist up, the hand signal for halt. I stopped. We both listened. From below, further down the drainage, past the point where the hemlock canopy thickened and the gully narrowed, maybe 60 or 70 yards ahead and below us a child's voice. High-pitched, thin, wavering in the way a cold child's voice wavers. "Help me. I'm down here. Help me, please." My radio was in my hand in 3 seconds. I keyed the transmitter and reported possible auditory contact with subject in Haw Branch drainage, sector 7-9er, approximately 60 yards below the sector 3 boundary, and requested confirmation of any other team in the area. Search Command confirmed no other teams in our drainage sector. We were alone in the gully. The voice called again. "I'm Lily. Please. I'm cold." Correct name. That was my first coherent thought, correct name, which is not remarkable in itself. She knows her own name. But then the second thought arrived right behind it. We had not broadcast the subject's name on any open radio channel since the search began. That's standard protocol on child searches. You don't put the name out on open frequencies because it creates false contact situations and because it can alarm family members monitoring scanner frequencies. Lily's name had been distributed on paper briefing sheets to team leaders and had been communicated verbally in in-person briefings. It had not gone out over the radio. The surrounding terrain, the drainage walls, the hemlock, the mountain itself, held no one who should have known that name except members of our team. Ricky was already moving, controlled descent, angling toward the sound. I was right behind her. The voice kept calling at intervals of about 30 seconds. We were closing the distance, 50 yards now, 40. I was running the math on the terrain below us as I descended. The drainage got significantly steeper and narrower about 30 yards down, transitioning into what the topo map showed as a near vertical section before it opened again. A 9-year-old alone could not have gotten below that constriction without significant injury. I was already recalculating what we were going to find. Then the voice said Ricky's name. Not Help me, or I'm cold, or I'm Lily. Ricky, her name. From 60 yards away in a drainage where she had not told anyone her name and where no radio traffic had carried it and where the only person who knew it was standing 2 feet above her on the slope. Ricky stopped, turned, and looked at me. I could see in her face that she'd heard it too, that she was running the same math I was running. The voice said her name again, then mine. Both of our names, one after the other, the way a child repeats things when they're frightened and have found something that works. Except the voice wasn't frightened. That was the thing I was only now fully noticing. It had the right pitch for frightened, the right wavering quality, the right breathiness, but the pacing was wrong. A genuinely frightened lost child calls for help in irregular bursts, loud and ragged and uncontrolled. This was regular. 30-second intervals, consistent volume, consistent pitch, patient, metronomic in a way that no cold, frightened 9-year-old is metronomic. I told Ricky to hold position. I got back on the radio. I gave Search Command our exact GPS coordinates and told them we had auditory contact that we could not confirm as the subject, and requested a secondary team to our location before we proceeded further into the drainage. The voice continued while we waited. It cycled through what it knew. Lily's name, our names, help me, I'm cold, please. The same phrases, in slightly varying orders, with the 30-second spacing that never changed. Once it said, I fell near the Alum Cave Junction. The Alum Cave Junction was 2 miles behind us on the primary trail. A child starting from the Alum Cave Junction could not have traveled into this drainage. The geography didn't work. The secondary team was 12 minutes away. We held our position on the drainage wall, both of us braced against the slope, listening. At some point during those 12 minutes, the voice stopped using Lily's name and started using only ours. Just our names, alternating, at the same 30-second spacing, not asking for anything, not adding anything new. Just cycling our names in that patient, uninflected voice in the dark of the drainage below us. Those 12 minutes on the drainage wall are the part I remember most precisely, more precisely than anything that came after. The rain on the hemlock above us, the cold seeping through my boots from the wet shale. Ricky braced 2 feet to my left, her hand on a rhododendron stem, her headlamp pointed down into the drainage. Both of us, not moving and not speaking and listening to something that knew our names, used them at 30-second intervals in a child's voice from somewhere below in the dark. The experience of knowing something is wrong and choosing to wait anyway because the protocol says to wait, and the protocol exists for exactly this kind of situation where your instinct is pulling you in 2 directions at once. Ricky said, very quietly, "That's not a kid." I said, "I know." The voice said her name again. Then it said mine. Then the sound changed. Not the voice, the environmental sound. The rain on the hemlock above us, which had been a constant background patter, went silent. Not because the rain stopped, I could still feel it on my jacket and my helmet. The sound stopped. The acoustic signature of the drainage changed the way a room's acoustics change when something large enters it and absorbs the sound that had been bouncing off empty walls. The drainage had been reverberating. Now it was damping. Something below us had moved closer. I had one hand on my radio, and I was about to key it again when Ricky's foot went out. The shale on the drainage wall was wet, and she'd been braced on a section that had been slowly becoming a problem for the 12 minutes we'd been standing on it. The undercut gave way, and she went down the slope. Not a full, uncontrolled fall. She got a hand on a root and arrested most of it, but she went over a small shelf in the drainage wall and ended up with her upper body above the shelf, hanging by the root with her legs dangling below. I was down to her in 3 seconds. Got both hands on her wrists. She was telling me she was okay. She had the root. She could get back up, and then she stopped talking. Her face did something that I have never seen on Ricky's face in 3 years of working beside her in bad terrain and worse situations. It went blank, not frightened blank. The expression of someone whose nervous system has just received information that is outside its processing capacity. She said, "Something has my feet." I pulled. The route she had was good, and I had good footing above the shelf, and I committed everything I had to vertical movement. Whatever was below her in the drainage, was pulling in the other direction. I could feel it in the load, not Ricky's weight, which I've assisted on rope rescues and steep terrain enough times to know how a person's weight transfers into a hold. Something more than her weight, something pulling downward with a steady, patient pressure that was not struggling and was not straining. It was just holding. I want to be precise about what I felt through my hands and arms in those seconds, because I've had people ask me whether it could have been the shale shifting under her or a root snagged around her boot. I've thought about both of those explanations carefully, and the answer is no. The load was directional. It was pulling straight down and slightly toward the drainage wall, the way something pulling from below and slightly behind her would pull. It was constant. It had weight behind it, and it adjusted twice while I was pulling. I felt the load increase, not by much, but by enough that I noticed it the way you notice when something on the other end of a rope takes up more tension. Whatever had her was not passive. It was active. It was holding her, and it was trying to keep her. I pulled harder. I planted both boots against the shelf edge and drove with my legs and kept my grip on her wrists locked. And then the load released. Not gradually. Released. The pressure from below cut off completely, and Ricky came up and over the shelf, and we both went backward onto the upper slope in a heap. I had a headlamp on, and I swung it down toward the shelf immediately. The drainage below the shelf was dark and narrow and full of hemlock roots and shadow. My headlamp reached about 15 feet down. In those 15 feet there was nothing visible. Below 15 feet the angle and the canopy ate the light completely. But I had the light at the right moment, the exact right moment, and in the 2 seconds before the drainage below the shelf went completely dark at the edge of my beam, I saw something down there redistribute its weight. Not move away, redistribute the way something large shifts when it goes from pulling to releasing, the adjustment of mass and balance in a body that has done one thing and is now deciding on the next thing. The shift was smooth and slow and completely controlled. Whatever released her did it deliberately and then resettled itself in the dark below the shelf with the patience of something that was not leaving, just waiting. Wrong proportions. That's what I carry from those 2 seconds more than anything else. The thing in the drainage below was too long. The limbs were too long relative to the mass. The geometry of how it resettled didn't correspond to any configuration of animal I've encountered in 8 years of working mountain terrain. Ricky was on her feet and moving up the slope before I had finished registering what I'd seen. I was right behind her, and I did not look down again. We hit the maintained trail at a run, and we didn't stop running until we'd covered 200 yards on paved trail surface toward the primary trailhead. Then we stopped, both of us breathing hard, and I got on the radio and reported our status and our position and told Search Command we were pulling out of Sector 79er and needed to be met at the Arch Rock Junction. The secondary team met us there. I told the team leader what had happened, all of it, in order, without editorializing. He listened with the particular expression of an experienced searcher receiving information that he doesn't know where to file. He did not dismiss it. He pulled the team from the Haw Branch drainage sector and redirected them to the primary trail corridor. At 14 minutes past 11 that morning, a ranger on the Gregory Bald Trail found Lily Crow alive. She was 3 miles from where we'd heard the voice, on the opposite side of the mountain, sheltering in a rock alcove on the Gregory Bald Ridge, under a space blanket she'd found in a day hiker's abandoned pack. She had been there since the first night. She was cold and dehydrated and frightened and not seriously injured. She could not have been in the Haw Branch drainage when we heard that voice. The distance and the terrain made it physically impossible. She confirmed to the NPS rangers who interviewed her that she had not left the Gregory Bald area since the first evening. She'd found the rock alcove and stayed in it because she'd been told in a school program that staying put was the right thing to do when you were lost. She was right. She did the right thing. She stayed put, and she was found. Whatever was in the Haw Branch drainage using her name was not Lily Crow. I filed my portion of the incident through the Blount County Mountain Rescue Documentation System as BCMR-2311, dated October of that year. The unusual contact in the drainage is documented in the field notes under the heading Auditory Anomaly, Possible Wildlife Source, Not Confirmed. That's the box it lives in officially. Possible Wildlife Source. Ricky's boots had marks on the ankle sections when we got back to the trailhead. Not claw marks exactly. The leather was compressed in a pattern of 4 points on each ankle, evenly spaced. The kind of indentation that happens when something grips with consistent pressure over a sustained period rather than impact damage. Grip marks. Each set of 4 spaced at roughly equal intervals around the circumference of the boot shaft, the way a hand grips a cylindrical object. She showed them to the team leader and to the incident commander. Both of them looked at the boots for a long time without saying anything. The incident commander, who has been coordinating searches in the Smokies for over 20 years, picked one boot up and held it under the tailgate light and turned it slowly. He set it back down and said the investigation would note the finding. Nobody said what they thought had made those marks. Nobody needed to. She still has those boots. She told me she keeps them because she wants to be able to look at them on the days when she starts to second guess what happened, the days when the rational explanations start to feel more credible in the distance of time than they felt in that drainage. The boots don't let her second guess it. The marks are still there, 4 points on each ankle, pressed into the leather by something that held on until it chose not to. She told me something else when we spoke about it a few months after. She said that in the moment it had her feet before she said anything to me. In the 3 or 4 seconds between feeling it and speaking, she looked down. She couldn't see anything. The shelf blocked her sightline. But she could feel it, she said, and she could feel that whatever was holding her was not holding her the way something holds prey. It wasn't squeezing. It wasn't pulling hard. It was holding gently, almost carefully, the way you hold something you don't want to damage. She said that was the part that scared her more than the grip itself, that it was careful with her, that it was being careful. I've thought about that a great deal in the years since. What it means when something in a drainage in the Smokies is careful with the person it's pulling toward it, what that carefulness suggests about purpose. I don't have conclusions. I have the question, and I carry it. She's probably right that the 2 seconds of warning mattered. I've thought about those 2 seconds a lot too. I've done 22 call-outs since the Lily Crow search. I'll keep doing the work. Children go missing in these mountains, and the work of finding them is worth doing, and I am not going to stop because of one October morning in one drainage. The Smokies will keep taking people who aren't prepared for them. That means the work continues, and I intend to keep doing it. But I run the search differently now, and if you're a volunteer or a ranger or anyone who does grid work in mountain terrain, I'm asking you to do the same. The protocol I follow now is simple, and it adds almost nothing to search time. Before you enter any drainage sector on a child search, you establish a voice baseline with your partner. You each say your own name, clearly on the radio, on record, once. So search command has your voice in the log. You establish a check word, one word that means abort and return to maintain trail immediately, something that wouldn't come up naturally in search communication. Ours is cardinal, redbird. If either of us says cardinal on the radio, both of us move to the nearest maintained trail without discussion and without waiting. The check word protocol costs nothing. On most searches, it is never used. On the kind of search where it matters, it might be the only thing that brings both of you back. If you're working a grid and you hear a voice that knows the subject's name, stop moving. That's expected, and it's not unusual. But if you hear a voice that knows your name, your actual name, and you have not told it your name, you are not in contact with the subject, radio your position, say your check word. Get to the maintained trail surface, and do not leave it until your team leader gives the all clear and accounts for your sector personally. Do not go into the drainage after the voice. Whatever is in those drainages has learned what you need to hear. It knows the name of the person you're looking for. It knows your name. It knows your partner's name. It knows what a lost child sounds like when they're cold and frightened and need someone to come toward them in the dark. And when you get close enough, it stops asking and it starts pulling. The maintained trail is the boundary. It stops at the maintained trail surface. I don't know why. I don't know what the pavement or the poured gravel represents to something that lives in a drainage in the Smokies. I just know it stopped there. I know it had Ricky and it let go and it did not follow us to the trail. Get to the trail. Stay on it. Trust the part of your brain that says that's not a child before your partner has to say it out loud. Lily Crow is 15 years old now, from what her mother posted in the family advocacy group that formed after the search. She goes to school in Maryville. She doesn't remember most of the night she spent on the Gregory Bald Ridge. She says the thing she remembers most clearly is that she stayed put because she'd been taught to, and that staying put meant she went home. That's the right lesson for her. It is the correct lesson, and I'm glad she learned it, and I'm glad it brought her home safely. For the rest of us, the ones who go into the drainages looking, the lesson is different and harder. The voice that knew our names was in that drainage before we stepped off the maintained trail. It was waiting. It heard us coming long before we heard it, and it chose its words carefully, and it used exactly the right name at exactly the right moment to keep us moving toward it. It knew the name of the girl we were looking for. It knew our names. It knew Ricky's daughter's name from one mention in a briefing room weeks before. I have no framework for that accumulation of knowledge that I'm satisfied with, and I've been looking for one for 3 years. What I know is what I felt through my hands and my arms in those seconds on the shelf. That load, that deliberate, patient, downward pressure that was not panicking and was not straining and held steady until it decided to let go. Whatever made that choice to hold longer, to release, made it deliberately. It had a reason for each decision. I don't know what those reasons were. I think about it on hard nights, and I don't arrive at anything I can write down. I don't know why it let go every day for going on 3 years, and I don't have that answer. What I know is that we were on the maintained trail surface less than a minute after it released her, and that the thing in that drainage did not follow us to the pavement. Stay on the trail. Establish your check word before you enter the drainage. Trust the voice in your gut before you trust the voice in the dark. And if your partner says that's not a child, believe them immediately. Say your check word and move. You can always search the drainage in daylight with a full team and the right equipment and proper lighting. You cannot undo what happens if something in the dark below a drainage shelf gets a second grip before you can pull back. My partner Tommy hasn't been back in the field since last August. He won't talk about what walked out of the cut line at dusk. I will. I've worked right-of-way vegetation management for 8 years. That's the technical name for what most people would call clearing brush under power lines, a job that is simultaneously more technical and more physically demanding than it sounds. And that takes you into terrain that most people never set foot in, because power line corridors don't follow roads or trails. They follow the shortest practical path between transmission structures, which means they cut straight through ridges and hollows and creek drainages and forested slopes that have seen no human traffic except the crew that cleared them last and the crew that cleared them before that. In eastern Kentucky, where the terrain is Appalachian ridge and hollow topography and the forest is dense second-growth hardwood recovering from a century of coal and timber extraction, that means the right-of-way takes you into places that are genuinely remote. Places where the nearest road is a 30-minute walk through dense forest in any direction and where your radio is the only connection to anything. I'm based out of a regional utility contractor's office in Hazard, Kentucky. Our service area covers a significant portion of the Kentucky power transmission network in the eastern coalfields, Leslie County, Perry County, Knott County, into the edge of the Daniel Boone National Forest, where the federal land abuts the private mineral rights that the utility has easements across. The work runs from spring through fall, with some winter work on emergency restoration after ice storms. We run two-man crews on most jobs. You need one person operating the equipment and one person watching terrain, watching overhead lines, watching the edge of the cut for the wildlife that comes into right-of-ways, in every season. Tommy Breck has been my assigned partner for 4 years. He's from Harlan County originally, which means he grew up in terrain like this, which means he has the particular orientation that people from eastern Kentucky have toward the mountains, a practical familiarity that doesn't romanticize the land, but doesn't underestimate it either. He knows what eastern Kentucky black bears look like, what they do when they come into a cut, how to read their sign. He knows the difference between a coyote track and a domestic dog track. He knows the sound a timber rattler makes before it decides you're not worth the energy. He knows how to work in 100-degree heat index without complaining, and how to run a chainsaw on a 40-degree slope without cutting himself, and how to read a topographic map fast enough that we're never standing still, with a piece of paper trying to figure out where we are. He is not a man who gets rattled by the things the woods normally put in front of you. In 4 years, we have run into every category of wildlife that eastern Kentucky produces. Bears twice, once at close range, once at distance. Coyotes regularly, copperheads and timber rattlers enough times that we don't stop work for them anymore, just give them space and wait for them to move off. We had a feral hog situation on a Knott County corridor 2 summers back that was genuinely unpleasant for about 20 minutes. We have never in 4 years had a situation where Tommy Breck ran. I want to establish that clearly before I tell you what Tommy Breck did when what came out of the cut line at dusk on the second day came out. He ran. He ran the way people run when the thing running them has bypassed every rational calculation. Their brain usually performs and gone straight to the part that is older and more honest, and that says the time for thinking is finished and the only correct action is distance. I need to back up. The job site was a transmission line right-of-way in the Daniel Boone National Forest, a corridor that runs roughly northeast-southwest through a section of the Redbird District, crossing 2 ridge lines and the drainage between them. The line had last been cleared 4 years prior and was significantly overgrown, young hardwood, tulip, poplar, and red maple mostly, with an understory of greenbrier and wild grapevine that had knit itself into a wall of vegetation across most of the corridor width. Our scope was mechanical clearing with a forestry mulcher mounted on a track carrier, supplemented by hand clearing with chainsaw and brush saw in the sections where the terrain was too steep for the machine. 2 days of work estimated for the corridor section in our assigned segment. We parked at the gravel access pad at the south end of the corridor segment on a Tuesday morning in late August of last year. The weather was what August in eastern Kentucky delivers: high 80s, saturated humidity, the air thick and still in the hollow below the ridge where the access pad sat. The kind of heat that makes work feel twice as hard and that makes you drink twice the water you plan to carry. We suited up in chainsaw chaps and hard hats and hearing protection and ground truth the paper map against the actual terrain, which in right-of-way work is always a necessary step because the paper shows you the line and the terrain, but not the combination of slope angle and vegetation density and substrate that determines how you're actually going to move through it. The first day was routine. We worked from the south end northward, the forestry mulcher opening the corridor width ahead of us, while Tommy and I worked the edges with handsaws on the steeper sections where the machine couldn't get traction. The cut opened up ahead of us in the slow, methodical way that heavy equipment work proceeds, not fast, not satisfying in any immediate sense, but producing the clear documented progress that this kind of contract work runs on. By end of day 1, we'd covered roughly 40% of the assigned segment. We documented the day's work, secured the equipment, and drove back to the motel in Hyden that the company had us in. The first thing I noticed on day 2 was the bark. 3 trees on the western edge of the cut, just inside the tree line, had been stripped. Not the clean peel of a bear marking, I know what that looks like, and this wasn't it. Bear marking is deliberate and specific. The animal stands on its hind legs and uses its claws and sometimes its teeth to create a mark at a particular height for a particular communicative purpose. The stripping on these trees was not that. It was higher than a bear mark. The lowest strip section was at least 7 feet off the ground, and the damage ran upward another 2 feet above that. And it wasn't claw-width strips, it was sheet damage, large sections of bark removed in irregular patches the cambium beneath showing pale and wet in the morning light. Something had been working on these trees in a way I couldn't match to any animal behavior I know, at a height that required either extreme size or the use of a tool. Tommy walked the base of all 3 trees and photographed them with his phone. He said he didn't know what had done it. I said the same. We noted it in the daily log and kept working. The second thing was the track. We found it in the creek mud at the drainage crossing in the middle of the corridor segment, where a small tributary crossed the right-of-way through a concrete culvert, and the banks on both sides held soft substrate. 1 track. Single impression. Bipedal, the geometry was clear. There was no possibility of misreading it as a 4-legged animal's print. The weight had settled into the mud with enough pressure to give us clear depth and edge definition. The foot was large, significantly larger than a man's foot. I wear a size 11, and my boot next to that print was meaningfully smaller. 5 toe impressions, roughly human spacing, no claw marks. The arch was deep. The whole print had the configuration of a large human foot, but at a scale that didn't correspond to any human being. Tommy crouched over it for a long time. He put his own boot alongside it, sole to sole, and looked at the comparison the way you look at something when you're trying to find an alternative explanation for what you're seeing. He said, "Bear." He said it the way you say something when you know it isn't right, but you want to put the word out there and see if it holds. A black bear standing upright can leave a print that resembles a human foot, the hind foot especially, when the animal stands fully erect, produces an impression that generations of people have mistaken for evidence of something bipedal. I know that. Tommy knows that. But a bear's hind foot has claw impressions, and the toe spacing is different, and the overall shape doesn't have the arch depth that this print had. Tommy looked at it for another 30 seconds, and then he stood up, and he didn't say bear again. Tommy took photographs. Neither of us said what we were each thinking. We kept working. The sound started around 3 in the afternoon. We were working the northern section of the segment, the section that crossed the second ridge and dropped into the hollow on the far side. The forestry mulcher was running significant mechanical noise, the kind that fills the corridor with sound and narrows your ability to hear anything outside the immediate work zone. But I had stepped back from the machine to check the corridor width against the easement stakes, and in that moment of standing still and relative quiet, I heard something in the tree line to the west. Not a distinct sound, a continuous low disturbance in the vegetation. The sound of something moving through dense second-growth hardwood parallel to the cut at a pace that matched my walking speed when I moved to reposition myself, and that stopped when I stopped. I called to Tommy over the machine noise. He shut it down and came to where I was standing. We both stood still and listened. The sound moved when I moved. It stopped when I stopped. It was in the tree line, consistent distance, maybe 30 yards into the forest from the cut edge. Not crashing, not blundering, moving through dense hardwood vegetation with a control that kept it from breaking branches. The sustained rustle of something large and deliberate moving through a space not designed for large things to move through quietly. Tommy called into the tree line once, the general hey you use to announce yourself to a bear that might not know you're there. No change. He picked up a chunk of blasted shale from the cut surface and threw it into the tree line, a crack of impact, leaves showering down. The sound in the tree line continued at the same distance and the same pace. It had not reacted. That was the detail that settled it for both of us without needing to be discussed. Normal forest animals react to unexpected impacts near them. The lack of reaction was its own information. We worked the rest of the afternoon with that sound in the western tree line. It followed the cut northward as we moved northward. When the machine was running, it was masked. In the pauses between equipment operation, it was there, sustained, parallel, patient. After an hour, I had almost normalized it, which I recognize now as a failure of attention. The constancy of a stimulus that isn't escalating will normalize itself to the brain if you let it, and I was letting it. I was focused on the work and on the daily progress targets and on the mechanical condition of the mulcher head, which had been throwing heat warnings since mid-morning, and I was letting the thing in the tree line become background noise. That was wrong. At 4:30, I shut the machine down for the day. We were 45 minutes from end of shift, the light in the hollow already going to the flat gray of late afternoon under dense canopy. Tommy was breaking down the hand tool setup on the carrier's platform. I was logging the day's progress on the work tablet. The sound of the tree line stopped. It had been continuous for 90 minutes, and it stopped with the abruptness of something that had reached a decision. Then Tommy said my name, not a call, not raised voice, my name, in a particular register that I have never heard from Tommy Breck in 4 years, and that I hope never to hear again. Flat, controlled. The register of a man whose brain has received something that every trained behavior he has is working to contain. I looked up from the tablet at the north end of the cut, where the cleared corridor met the uncut forest at the edge of our segment boundary. Something was standing in the cut line. It was standing on 2 legs, upright. It was at a distance I estimated at around 80 yards, which meant I could see its shape clearly against the tree line, but not its detail. The shape was wrong. Too tall. I am 6 feet, and the carrier I was standing next to tops out at just over 8 feet at the cab roof, and the figure at the end of the cut was taller than the carrier. Long arms, hanging well below where arms should hang on a body that size. Still. Completely still. It wasn't moving, and it wasn't shifting its weight, and it wasn't doing any of the things a living body does when it's been standing in one position, the micro adjustments, the weight transfers, the slight postural movements that are so automatic we don't think of them as movement until we see something that doesn't do them. It was standing at the end of the cut, the way a post stands, with no investment in the standing at all, except it was watching us. I knew it was watching us, the way you know something is watching you, from a distance, not from any specific detail. I could resolve at 80 yards, but from the particular quality of the attention, the weight of it. The way the air between you and a watching thing has a different quality than the air between you and an empty space. It had been in the western tree line for 90 minutes, and now it had come out of the trees, and it was standing in the cut in the last of the afternoon light, and it had made a decision about that. It used Tommy's voice. From 80 yards, clearly, at a volume that said this was not meant to carry 80 yards, but was pitched for conversation, for close range, for the voice of someone standing nearby. Tommy's voice saying my name. His specific inflection, the way he says my name when he is about to hand something off, the slight upward note at the end, the tone of a man who has my attention and is about to give me information I need. My name in Tommy's voice from something at the end of the cut that was not Tommy, because Tommy was standing 6 feet to my left, with both hands on the carrier's safety rail, and his face pointed at the north end of the cut, and no expression at all on it. The thing at the end of the cut said my name again. Same inflection, same volume. Patient. The way something is patient when it has learned that a specific sound produces a specific response, and is waiting for the response to occur. It was testing a key in a lock, and the key was a voice it had spent the afternoon collecting from 30 yards inside the tree line while we worked without knowing we were being listened to. Tommy ran. He ran south, back down the cut toward the access pad, the direction we come from, and he ran the way I described earlier, not tactically, not with any plan, with the total commitment of a man whose body had made the decision before his mind finished processing the input. His hard hat came off at the first stride, and he didn't stop for it. He was 40 yards down the cut before I had finished registering what I was seeing at the north end. I ran too. I am not embarrassed to say that. I turned south, and I ran, and I did not look back at the north end of the cut, and I did not look back at the tree line, and I ran, and the gravel access pad was 160 yards, and the truck was on the access pad, and I covered that distance as fast as I have ever covered any distance in my life. The thing called my name twice more while I was running. From behind me, from the north end of the cut, same volume, same inflection, and then from the tree line to the west, at a distance that had reduced from 30 yards to something much closer. Closer than 30 yards. Closer than I wanted to hear Tommy's voice coming from something that was not Tommy. I did not count paces. I ran. He had his hand on the door handle from the inside. I got in, got the key in, got the engine over on the first try, and I pulled out of that access pad and onto the forest road, with a speed that was not compatible with the road's surface quality, and that I don't regret. We drove in silence. The forest road to the state road was 4 miles. Neither of us spoke for those 4 miles. On the state road, headed back toward Hyden, Tommy said, "I'm not going back." I said, "Okay." He said, "I'm not calling it in." I said, "I'll handle it." He said nothing else for the rest of the drive. I called the crew supervisor that night and told him Tommy had a family situation and would be off the rest of the contract. I documented the tree damage and the track in the log as wildlife sign of undetermined origin. I went back to the site the next morning alone, with the truck parked at the access pad with the engine running, and I completed the remaining segment from the south end northward, and I did not cross the drainage crossing, and I did not approach the northern segment boundary, and I finished what I could finish and documented the rest as requiring a follow-up crew, and I drove out. Going back alone the next morning was one of the harder things I've done in 8 years of field work. Not because of what I expected to find, but because of what I didn't know I'd find, and because the access pad and the first 100 yards of the cut were still familiar daytime terrain, and everything beyond the drainage crossing was a question I wasn't going to answer alone. I kept the engine running on the truck the entire time I was on site. I worked fast. I checked the tree line every 2 minutes. The cut was quiet and empty, and nothing moved in the western tree line, and I found no additional tracks, and the bark damage on the 3 trees at the cut edge was the same as I'd photographed the day before. Everything was exactly as it should be, and that normalcy felt less reassuring than it should have, because the thing that had been there was still something that had been there, and the absence of it in daylight was not the same as it being gone. The company sent a 2-person crew to complete the northern segment the following week. They had no reported incidents. The crew lead told me afterward that he'd seen a large black bear in the cut on the second day of their work, which he'd noted in the daily log. I read the log entry. Black bear, estimated weight 250, exited cut line at north boundary moving west. I did not say anything about the distinction between a black bear and what Tommy and I had seen at the north boundary. The crew lead had his explanation, and it was a workable explanation, and it let him do his job without carrying what I was carrying, and I decided that was fine. Tommy filed a medical leave through the company HR system. The reason listed is a personal matter. He has not returned to field work. I saw him once, in November, at a gas station in Hazard, and we talked for about 3 minutes about nothing in particular. He looked fine. He looked like Tommy. He was wearing his Harlan County Fair sweatshirt that he's worn every fall for as long as I've known him, and he had a large coffee, and he asked how the Knott County contracts were going, and I told him fine, and he nodded, and we said goodbye. He looked like a man who had made a decision and was at peace with it. He looked like a Tommy who had decided that the version of his life that included going back into that forest was a version he was done with, and that the version of his life that didn't include it was preferable in every way that mattered to him now. I can't argue with that. I understand it completely from the inside. What I can explain is the part I haven't told you yet. The part that I didn't put in the work log, and that I didn't tell the crew supervisor, and that I've only told my wife, who listened, and then asked one question: "Are you going to keep doing this job?" and accepted my yes without further discussion. That acceptance is something I don't take lightly. At the access pad, when I was getting into the truck behind Tommy, I was the last one there. I was the last one at the cut. I looked back. I don't know why. My body turned before I had finished forming the thought. My eyes went back to the cut on their own. The figure was gone from where it had been standing. The north end of the cut was empty. The tree line there, the same wall of second-growth hardwood it had always been. The corridor of cleared vegetation running up the ridge in the evening light, with nothing at the top of it. It was in the cut, 30 yards from the truck door. It had covered the 80 yards between the north end and the access pad while we were running, and it had done it silently, and it was standing still in the corridor watching me with the same absolute stillness it had shown at the north end of the cut, the stillness that had no investment in itself, the stillness of something that can wait. I held whatever passed for eye contact at 30 yards in that light for 2 seconds. Then I got in the truck. I did not look in the mirrors pulling out. The forest road hit the paved state road 4 miles later, and I drove until my hand stopped shaking on the wheel, which took longer than those 4 miles. Whatever comes to the edge of that corridor at dusk has been listening all day from 30 yards inside the tree line. It knows your name from hearing your partner say it over the noise of the equipment. It knows your partner's voice from the same source. At dusk it comes out of the trees, and it uses what it has collected, your name and your partner's voice, from the direction your partner is not standing, because that combination is the one most likely to make you turn and walk toward it without thinking. If you work a cut in eastern Kentucky or anywhere in this range of terrain, here is what you do when the machine goes down at end of shift and the sound in the tree line stops and your partner's voice comes from the wrong direction. You do not respond. You do not look toward the sound. You get in the vehicle and you start the engine and you drive to the paved road without stopping. The asphalt is the line. It will not cross the asphalt. Do not look back on the way out. Not at the cut. Not in the mirrors. You know it's standing there watching you go. You don't need to see it to know that. Keep your eyes on the road. It ends at the pavement. Get to the pavement and keep driving, and don't stop until the county road puts at least 3 miles between you and that hollow. Tommy made the right call. His body knew before his mind did. That's the thing I keep coming back to. 8 years of field work, feral hogs at close range, timber rattlers, 2 bear encounters, and his body knew immediately and completely, and ran before his mind had assembled a single rational sentence about what it was seeing. Trust that part of yourself. Whatever it is that bypasses the calculation, trust it. When it says run, you run. You can figure out what you saw later from the paved road, with the engine running and the distance growing. That's the only rule that matters out there. On the first night, it circled the base of the tower. On the second night, it tested each leg. On the third night, I heard the first rung of the access ladder bend under something that weighed more than any man. I was in my second season as a seasonal fire lookout with the Pisgah National Forest, contracted through the Forest Service on a solo posting at a tower in the Pisgah district of western North Carolina. I'm not going to name the tower, and I'm not going to name the exact ridge it sits on, because the tower is still staffed during fire season, and I'm not interested in adding to the workload of whoever is posted there by sending people out to the access road to look for something they should hope they don't find. What I can tell you is that it sits at just over 4,000 feet on a north-south ridge in the Pisgah, the cab visible from 3 counties on a clear day. The surrounding terrain, a mix of mature hardwood forest on the lower slopes and the dense laurel and rhododendron thicket that the Pisgah produces at elevation. The tower is a standard Forest Service design, 4 steel legs, cross-braced with angle iron, access ladder running up the south face to a catwalk that wraps the perimeter of the cab itself. A 7x7 room of glass and timber with a 180-degree view in every direction. You live in that cab during your posting. You sleep there, eat there, run your weather observations there, track smoke signatures there. In a tower with no road access closer than a 3/4-mile trail hike, the cab is the entire world for the duration of your shift. Some people find that confinement oppressive. I found it clarifying in a way that I hadn't anticipated and couldn't fully explain until later, the reduction of everything to the immediate, the visible, the measurable. You know exactly where you are. You can see everything around you for miles in daylight. There are very few surprises in a fire lookout cab and good visibility. What people don't always account for is the night. In daylight, at 4,000 feet in the Pisgah, with clear air, your sight lines extend to the horizon in every direction, and nothing can approach the tower without you seeing it for a long time before it arrives. At night, it's the reverse. The cab sits at the top of a steel column in a forest you cannot see into. The darkness around the tower is complete in a way that lower elevations aren't. The ridge blocks the ambient glow from the valley towns, and the forest canopy blocks the sky on 3 sides, and what remains is the dome of stars overhead and nothing else. You know exactly where you are, and you cannot see anything below the catwalk railing. The ladder is the only way in or out, and you are alone. That isolation in daylight is clarifying. That isolation at night is something else entirely, And if you have not sat in a fire lookout cab at 3 in the morning on a moonless night in the Pisgah listening to what is in the forest below you, you do not have an accurate picture of what the job actually is. I had been in contact with the lookout at the nearest neighboring tower, a woman named Jess, who was in her 3rd season, and who I had met during the pre-season training in Brevard. We communicated daily on the Forest Service radio frequency, the standard check-ins that the district requires, and the non-essential conversation that long solo postings generate between people who are glad to have someone to talk to. She was good at the work, precise in her smoke reports, reliable on her weather observations, and she had the particular dry wit that people develop when they spend a lot of time alone with their thoughts in a small room above the tree line. We had fallen into a rhythm of a morning check-in, a midday weather exchange, and an evening sign-off, the kind of daily contact that keeps the isolation from becoming oppressive. On a Tuesday night in late September, she radioed me at 11 at night, which was unusual. Check-ins are at set intervals during the day, and general quiet is expected after 9. The transmission was clear, but she was speaking at a lower volume than normal, the quality of someone who doesn't want to make noise in their environment. She said something was circling the base of her tower. She described it carefully, the way she did everything, not with alarm, but with the same methodical precision she used in smoke reports. She said it had been moving in the laurel and rhododendron thicket around the tower base for about 45 minutes. The sound was consistent and bipedal, she used that word specifically, bipedal, moving at a steady pace in a wide circuit around the perimeter of the base. The circuit took approximately 3 minutes to complete, and it had done it at least 15 times by the time she called me. She said she'd put her spotlight on it twice. The light hit the thicket and showed her nothing. The sound stopped each time the beam swung toward it and resumed each time she moved the light away. She said the thing that bothered her most wasn't the circling. It was the way it responded to the spotlight. It understood the relationship between the light and being seen. That level of awareness was not consistent with any wildlife behavior she'd encountered in 3 seasons on that tower. Bears investigate light sources. Deer freeze and stare at them. Neither circles a structure at a consistent distance and then stops moving specifically when a spotlight enters its vicinity and resumes specifically when it leaves. That's not instinct, that's calculation. I told her to stay in the cab and keep the light handy and radio the district if it escalated. She said okay. She sounded controlled. She said goodnight and signed off. 2 hours later, at 1 in the morning, she transmitted again. Same low volume, tighter this time, the vocal quality of someone who has been sitting very still in a small room for 2 hours and does not want to move suddenly. She said it had stopped circling about 20 minutes ago, and she couldn't hear anything from below anymore. She said the silence was worse than the circling had been. When it was circling, she knew where it was. The silence meant she didn't know where it was. She said she was going to try to sleep and that she'd call me in the morning. I acknowledged and signed off, and then I sat in the chair in my own cab, and I did not tell her what I had been hearing around the base of my tower since approximately 10:30 that night. The same sound, identical to what she'd described. Bipedal, consistent distance from the tower base, circling, stopping when the spotlight hit the thicket below, resuming when the light moved. I had been sitting with it for 90 minutes by the time she first called me, and I had not reached for the radio because I was still in the portion of the experience where I was building explanations, working through the list of what it could be before I accepted what it probably was. By the time she called at 1 in the morning and signed off, my list of alternative explanations was empty, and I was sitting in the chair with the spotlight in my lap and watching the trapdoor in the floor and the 4 walls of glass and not sleeping. I want to describe what that first night was like because the experience of sitting in a fire lookout cab at 4,000 feet listening to something circle the base of your tower for 90 minutes is not something that translates cleanly into summary. The cab is 7 by 7 feet of glass and timber. In daylight it feels like an observation platform, a perch, an advantaged position. At night, with something in the thicket below making a sound that you cannot see the source of, it feels like what it actually is, a box. A small elevated box with 1 exit point and 1 access ladder and no secondary route out. The glass that gives you sight lines in daylight becomes, at night, with the thicket invisible below the catwalk railing, just walls. Transparent walls that show you only what the darkness allows, which is nothing. I put the spotlight on the thicket 4 times during those 90 minutes. Each time the sound stopped at the instant the beam swept toward the area the sound was coming from, not after the light reached it. At the instant the light began to move in that direction. Each time I held the beam on the thicket and found nothing visible. Each time I moved the light away, and the circling resumed within 10 seconds. The precision of that response was what I couldn't explain away. A bear reacts to a light source when the light reaches it. This was reacting to the movement of the light source before the beam arrived. It was tracking the spotlight's direction from inside the thicket and ceasing movement in anticipation of the beam. That requires knowing where the light is, where it is pointed, and where it is about to go. That requires attention directed at the light source. That is not animal behavior. That is the behavior of something that is watching you while you watch for it. The second night my tower went quiet after 3 circuits, and I slept in the lookout chair with my back against the Osborne firefinder and the spotlight across my thighs. I want to be precise about that. I slept in the chair, not on the cot. The cot would have put my back to the glass on the north wall and my face away from the trapdoor in the floor. The chair in the center of the cab gave me sight lines to all 4 walls of glass and direct line of sight to the trapdoor hardware. I could see the latch from the chair without turning my head. I positioned it that way, deliberately. That is how I slept for the remainder of that posting. 4 hours at a stretch, in the chair, back to the firefinder, spotlight within reach. I told myself the first night I did it that I would go back to the cot once I had a baseline of normal nights, 2 or 3 nights of nothing, and then the cot. That baseline never came. I slept in the chair for the rest of the contract. The cot stayed made. I never felt the urge to use it again. On the second night, before it went quiet, I heard something I hadn't heard the first night. In between the circuits, in the pauses when the circling stopped, I heard something moving from leg to leg around the base of the tower. The angle iron cross bracing of a fire lookout tower makes a distinctive sound when weight is applied to it, a low metallic resonance, more felt than heard, that the structure carries upward through the legs to the cab floor. You learn the structure's sounds during a posting. You learn how it talks in the wind, how the thermal expansion of the steel sounds in the afternoon heat, how the guy wire tension changes with temperature. After 2 seasons, I knew every sound that tower made under every condition I'd put it through. The sound it made that second night was not a sound I'd heard before. 4 legs, cross-braced at multiple intervals. The resonance moved from the southeast leg to the southwest leg to the northwest leg to the northeast leg in sequence, the progression of something working methodically around the structure, applying weight to the bracing at each leg and then releasing it and moving to the next position, the sequence repeated 3 times. I sat in the center of the cab with my hand flat on the floor between repetitions, feeling the vibration the structure was carrying and trying to convince myself I was misinterpreting it and failing. Testing. The word arrived in my mind with the precision of a correct answer. It was testing the legs, assessing the structure, working out the engineering. Something that had been circling the base for 2 nights had moved to the next phase of whatever it was working out, and the next phase was determining whether the structure was sound enough to bear its weight. I had the radio in one hand and the spotlight in the other, and I was watching the trapdoor in the floor with the undivided focus of someone who has calculated that the access ladder below it is the only point of entry, and that the trapdoor hardware is the only physical barrier between them and whatever is below. On the 3rd night, it used the ladder, not all the way up, not to the catwalk. It put its weight on the first rung at the base of the ladder, and the steel flexed under it with a resonance I had never felt in 2 seasons on that tower, heavier than any flex I'd experienced, heavier than any person I'd ever had on that structure, a deep low vibration that came up through the ladder frame and through the floor and into the soles of my boots as I stood at the trapdoor with the spotlight in my hand. The weight was wrong. Too much of it. Applied to one rung in a way that said whatever was on that rung was not a person. 1 rung, then silence, then the second rung flexed under it. I was standing at the trapdoor with the spotlight when the trapdoor latch moved. Not violently, not an impact, a pressure, the steel hook shifting in its eye a fraction of an inch, the way a latch shifts when something is pushing on the door it's securing from the underside. Something below had placed its weight, or its hand, on the bottom of the trapdoor and was pressing upward, not hard enough to overcome the latch, just enough to test it. The same methodology as the legs, now applied to the final barrier. The hook and eye hardware on a Forest Service lookout trapdoor is designed to keep the hatch from blowing open in high wind. It is not designed for what I was looking at. I had both hands on the spotlight and my feet planted on either side of the trapdoor frame, and there was nothing between whatever was on the second rung below me and the inside of the cab except 4 inches of plank timber and a hook and eye latch I could have opened with one finger. I opened the south window. I swung the spotlight down and turned it on at full power. The pressure on the trapdoor released immediately. The latch settled back into its natural position. The rung below ceased flexing. The weight transferred off the structure all at once. I felt the tower go still under my feet, the way a rope goes slack when the load on the other end releases. Whatever had been on that ladder stepped off it, back onto the ground in a single motion, and then there was nothing on the ladder and nothing pressing on the trapdoor, and the spotlight beam was flooding the south face of the tower in white light and showing me nothing. I held the spotlight on the ladder and the tower base for 40 minutes. I counted the minutes on my watch. The thicket around the base was visible in the spillover light from the beam, and it showed me vegetation and compressed shadows and nothing that moved or had mass. I heard nothing from below. I did not hear it leave. I did not hear it circle again. I held the light until I was certain the 40 minutes were real, and then I retracted the spotlight and closed and latched the south window, and I sat in the chair with the spotlight across my thighs, and I watched the trapdoor latch for the rest of the night without sleeping. Nothing came to the ladder again that night. The latch did not move again. The structure did not flex. The tower held its silence until the pre-dawn light came through the east glass and the forest below became visible again, and I could confirm with my eyes what my ears had been telling me for the last 3 hours, that there was nothing there. I did my morning weather observation and logged it. I made coffee and I ate, and I did the job. That is what you do. Nothing came to the ladder again that night. I radioed Jess at 6 in the morning and I told her what had happened. All of it, in order, no omissions. The circling on the first night that I hadn't told her about. The leg testing on the second night. The weight on the first rung, and then the second rung, and then the spotlight and the silence. I told her about the 40 minutes I'd held the light on the ladder base before I retracted it. I told her about sleeping in the chair with the spotlight in my lap for the rest of the posting. I did not editorialize or apologize for not calling her sooner. I just gave her the account in sequence and let her process it. She was quiet for most of it. When I finished, she said she'd heard the leg testing on her tower on the second night as well, the weight moving from leg to leg in sequence, the same pattern I described, the same metallic resonance transmitted upward through the structure. She'd put the spotlight on the base and heard the sound cease, and had not heard it return that night. She said she had also been sleeping in the chair for the duration of the posting. She said she was glad I'd told her. She said she wished I'd told her sooner, and I said I understood, and I was sorry, and she said no, she understood why I hadn't, and we left it there. We spent another hour on the radio working through what we knew. 2 towers on the same ridge system. Identical behavior sequence on the same night, circling first, leg testing second, ladder approach third. Both towers coordinated or independent, we couldn't determine. The light response was the same at both locations. Behavior ceased when the spotlight made contact and resumed when it withdrew. That consistency across 2 separate locations on the same ridge suggested it was a consistent property of whatever had been there, not a coincidence or a misread. She said something during that conversation that I've thought about a lot since. She said the circling felt like reconnaissance. 3 nights of escalating approach, circling the perimeter, then testing the structure, then attempting the access point that's not the behavior of an animal investigating a novel stimulus. That's a methodology. something that circles a structure for a full night before touching it, and then spends a second night testing the structural integrity before attempting to climb on the third, is working through a problem in sequence. It has a goal, and it is working toward the goal systematically, and it is calibrating its approach based on what it learns at each stage. That framing the thing as a problem solver, not an animal, is the one that stays with me, because it explains the light response. A problem solver that encounters a countermeasure modifies its approach. The spotlight was a countermeasure. The perimeter floods were a stronger countermeasure. It assessed both and decided the equation had changed, and it went somewhere else. Not because it was frightened, because it was calculating. The Forest Service towers are equipped with perimeter flood lamps for exactly this kind of situation. Wildlife deterrence, the spec sheet says, and it's not wrong. I turned the perimeter floods on that night and ran them from dusk to dawn. The floods throw light in a full circle around the base of the tower at ground level, eliminating the shadow that the tower legs and the thicket create in the spotlight's beam. Full perimeter illumination, no shadow coverage at the base. Nothing circled that night. Nothing tested the legs. Nothing came to the ladder. I ran the floods every night for the rest of the posting. The generator fuel consumption went up, which I documented in my end-of-season report as wildlife deterrence operations, which is an accepted fuel expenditure line and which the district approved without comment. Jess ran her floods too. Same result. Nothing on the ladder for the rest of her posting. She and I have talked about it several times since the season ended. Neither of us has a clean explanation. We have the shared facts. The identical experience at two towers on the same ridge system, the light sensitivity, the methodical quality of the behavior, the circling, the leg testing, the sequential ladder approach, all of it suggesting something that was assessing the structures deliberately and systematically, working through the problem of how to access something at the top of a steel column on a forested ridge at night. Whatever it was, it understood that light meant risk. It modified its behavior in direct response to the presence of light. That's the thing I sit with most. A thing that changes its behavior based on what it perceives you can do to it is a thing that is thinking about you. It is running calculations. It decided the spotlight changed the equation and it backed off. It decided the perimeter floods changed the equation further and it went somewhere else. What I don't know is where somewhere else is, whether it went to another tower on another ridge, whether there are lookouts sitting in their cabs right now in some other district of the Pisgah or the Nantahala who are hearing something in the thicket below them and have not yet reached for the spotlight, whether the thing working its patient way up the problem of a fire lookout tower at night is still out there on the same ridge or has moved on to terrain I'm not aware of. What I know is that my posting ended without incident after I deployed the perimeter floods. What I know is that Jess's posting ended the same way. What I know is that whatever spent 3 nights working through the problem of my tower decided the problem had become unsolvable with the lights running and went somewhere else to work on a different problem. That's a real thing that happened, and the documentation is in my end-of-season report under fuel expenditure and in Jess's report under the same heading, and neither of those reports says what it's actually about, but both of them tell the same story if you read them alongside each other. If you are posted in a fire lookout tower anywhere in the Pisgah or the Nantahala or the Uwharrie, anywhere in the southern Appalachian highlands, here's what I am asking you to do. Run your perimeter floods every night from dusk to dawn, every night of your posting, not just the nights when you hear something circling. The floods are there. The generator fuel is authorized. There is no good reason not to run them, and there is at least one very good reason to run them that I cannot put in an official report, but that I can put here. If you hear the ladder flex under a weight that is not yours, turn on every light you have. The spotlight, the floods, the interior lights, every source. Do it immediately. Do not wait to hear the second rung. The light is the boundary. Everything I observed across 3 nights and 2 towers told me the same thing. It will not come into the light. I don't know why. I don't know what about artificial light at full power changes the calculation for something that is otherwise methodical and patient and willing to spend 3 nights working its way up to a ladder. I just know it does. Turn on the lights. Stay in the cab. Keep the trapdoor latched. And if you hear something on that ladder that is heavier than you do, not wait every light you have all at once. That is the rule. It has kept me here to tell you about it. Darnell made it to the truck. I didn't see how. By the time I got there, he was sitting in the passenger seat with his hands in his lap, staring straight ahead, and he hasn't said a single word to another human being in 4 months. I've been a licensed land surveyor for 12 years, the last 9 of them working federal contracts in the Mid-Atlantic region boundary surveys for the Forest Service, right-of-way establishment for federal easements, cadastral work on public land parcels in Virginia, West Virginia, and Western Maryland. It is precise work that attracts precise people. You are working with legal documents, property records, and physical monuments that define boundaries that have existed in some cases for over a century, and the accuracy of your work determines whether those boundaries are legally defensible or not. There is no margin for creative interpretation. You measure, you record, you verify. The instrument tells you what is there, and you document what the instrument tells you. I tell you this because what happened in the Monongahela National Forest in the Cheat Mountain District of West Virginia in September of last year is something I have been unable to reconcile with 12 years of instrumentation-based field practice. And the failure of reconciliation is not for lack of trying. I have been over the data from that day, the field notes, the instrument logs, the GPS track, the photographs, dozens of times. The data is consistent. The data is internally coherent. The data describes something that should not have been there. Darnell Weiss has been my survey technician for 6 years. He is 29 years old, trained at Fairmont State University in surveying technology, and he has the particular calm precision that this work requires. He can hold a rod plumb in wind and read a vernier to 3 seconds of arc, and he catches my arithmetic errors before I finish writing them. He is not prone to anxiety, and he is not prone to drama, and he does not exaggerate what the instrument shows him. He reads the instrument and he records what it says, and in 6 years I have never had to question his readings. He grew up in Upshur County. He knows Cheat Mountain terrain the way people who grow up in a landscape know it, not from maps and contour lines, but from the particular feel of the ground under a boot and the way the air moves differently in a north-facing hollow versus an east-facing slope, and the sound a creek makes when you are still too far away to see it. In 6 years of working steep terrain together, I had come to rely on his situational awareness as a second set of eyes and ears that process the environment in ways that supplement what the instrument tells me. He was good at the work. He was very good at the work. He has not spoken since September 15th of last year. Not to me, not to his family, from what I understand through his mother, who called me in November. Not to anyone. He goes through his days. He is living with his parents in Buchanan now. He has not been back to his apartment in Elkins, and he is physically present, and he responds to direct questions with gestures, and he eats and he sleeps. He has been evaluated. His cognition is intact, according to the assessment. He simply does not speak. His doctors are calling it a trauma-induced selective mutism, which is a clinical way of saying that something happened and his nervous system has decided that speaking is a risk it is not going to take until it decides otherwise. I was the one who called his mother the evening of September 15th. I told her there had been an incident in the field, that Darnell was physically uninjured, and that I was bringing him to the hospital in Elkins to be evaluated. I did not tell her what the incident was. I told the evaluating physician there had been a wildlife encounter that had been frightening and disorienting. That is the closest to accurate I could get within the language available to me at the time. We set up at the southwest corner of the parcel at 7:30 in the morning and ran the first leg of the boundary northward. The weather was what September gives you in the Monongahela, when the summer heat has broken and the overnight temperatures have started dropping into the 50s clear sky, cool air with enough bite in it to make you glad for the base layer, the hardwood canopy still fully leafed but just beginning, and the color turn that would peak in 3 weeks. Good surveying weather, The kind of day where the air is dry enough that the instrument's optics are clear and the footing is firm enough that you can move between setups without burning half your energy managing the terrain. The monuments were where the record said they'd be: iron pins at the corners, the concrete reference monuments in good condition, the boundary trees blaze marked with the Forest Service axe blaze on the appropriate faces. The southwest corner pin was tight in the ground and showed no frost heave. The northwest corner was the same. The western boundary line between them ran straight and clean, the instrument angles closing within acceptable tolerance on both ends. 2 hours of work that went exactly as it should, producing exactly the data the contract required, building the confidence that comes from confirmed field conditions. Good work. The parcel was going to be straightforward. We broke for lunch at the northwest corner, sitting on a down log, eating from our packs and going over the afternoon plan on the paper map. The northeast quadrant was the terrain I had been watching on the topo steepest slope, densest canopy, furthest from the road. I told Darnell we'd take it slow up there, shorter setups, more check-ins. He said fine. He ate his sandwich. He looked at the map. That was the last normal conversation I had with him. The anomaly started in the northeast quadrant of the parcel, on the upper slope approaching the north boundary line. This section of the parcel was the most remote, furthest from the forest road, steepest terrain, the densest canopy cover of any part of the parcel. The kind of ground where you move slowly and you watch your footing and you don't assume anything about what's under the leaf litter. The hardwood up there was old growth in patches, the canopy overhead high and dense enough that the forest floor was dim even at midday, the light filtered to a flat gray-green by the foliage above. Sound traveled differently up there too. The dense canopy absorbed it rather than reflecting it, and the ambient noise of the forest was muffled in a way that made the slope feel quieter than it should have been. Not silent, quieter, the particular quiet of a place that is absorbing sound rather than producing it. I noticed that quality when we moved into the northeast quadrant around 11 in the morning. I noted it without assigning it any significance because the acoustic character of a forest changes with canopy density and species composition and a dozen other variables that I track as ambient data and file in the background. It didn't mean anything. It was just quieter. Darnell was holding the rod at the next monument position, roughly 60 yards ahead of me on the slope, while I was running the total station from a setup point. On a level bench about 15 yards back from the slope break, he was standing still, rod plumb, waiting for me to confirm the reading. I was reading through the instrument, bringing the crosshairs onto the prism he was holding, when the instrument flagged an obstruction. The total station has an obstruction detection system. When something enters the measurement path between the instrument and the prism, it flags the reading as potentially compromised and stores the obstruction data alongside the measurement. The system is designed to catch things like brush and branches that enter the measurement path during a reading. When it flags, you look up, identify the obstruction, clear it if you can, and reread. I looked up from the eyepiece to identify what had crossed the path. The slope between me and Darnell was clear. Open hardwood, widely spaced trunks, the understory thin enough that I could see Darnell plainly at 60 yards, the orange of his vest visible between the gray-brown trunks. Nothing was between us. No branch had swung into the measurement path. No animal had crossed the slope. The terrain between my instrument and his rod position was as clear to my eyes as it had been when I'd set up the reading. I looked back through the instrument. The obstruction flag was still active. The instrument was still detecting mass in the measurement path. Mass with a reflectivity signature. The return beam analysis was reporting a partial obstruction with reflectivity values consistent with biological material. A surface that absorbs and reflects the instrument beam the way organic tissue does, differently from rock, differently from wood, differently from the glass of the reflector prism. The instrument was seeing something biological in the measurement path, something I could not see. I spent a moment with the alternative explanations. The instrument has a fault mode where signal interference from multiple reflective surfaces can produce false obstruction flags, a wet tree trunk at a certain angle, a standing puddle, occasionally a smooth rock face. I knew the fault mode and I knew its signature, and this was not it. The obstruction data was clean and consistent, not the erratic scatter of a false positive. It had the profile of a real target. I moved the instrument horizontally, sweeping the angle slowly across the measurement path, reading the obstruction data as I swept. The mass had a position. It was standing approximately 30 yards from my setup point, roughly centered on the line between me and Darnell. Its width, based on the angle sweep, was consistent with something between 2 and 3 feet across at the widest point. Its height from the ground level return to the point where the beam cleared the obstruction and went on to find Darnell's prism was consistent with something between 8 and 9 feet tall. I swept the full angular range twice to confirm the readings. Both sweeps returned the same position, the same dimensions, the same reflectivity signature. The instrument was not wavering. It was not producing scatter. It was telling me, with the precision that 12 years of field practice has taught me to trust, that something 8 to 9 feet tall was standing 30 yards from me on that slope. I called to Darnell. I asked him if he could see anything between us on the slope. He scanned the terrain between his position and mine and said no, the slope was clear. I told him the instrument was flagging an obstruction at roughly the midpoint. He looked directly at the area the instrument was pointed at, directly at the position the data indicated, and he said the slope looked clear to him. I moved the instrument to a new setup angle, trying to triangulate from a second position. I carried the instrument 15 yards laterally along the bench, set up again, and ran the obstruction sweep. The second setup confirmed the first. The same mass, the same position in relation to the slope features, the same height and width profile. From two different instrument positions, the data described the same thing standing in the same place. It had been there for at least 20 minutes by the time I made the second confirmation. 20 minutes of standing still in the measurement path between my instrument and Darnell's rod position, not moving, not shifting. The stillness of something that was choosing to stand still, rather than the stillness of something inanimate. I know that distinction is one I can't prove from instrument data alone. But I had been watching the readings for 20 minutes, and nothing inanimate holds a position with that precision on a forested slope for that duration without any variation at all. The instrument data showed no micro movement, no postural drift. Whatever was there was holding itself completely still. And then the data changed. The obstruction shifted. In the space of 2 seconds between readings, the angular position of the mass changed by approximately 15 degrees from my second setup point. At 30 yards of distance, 15 degrees of angular change corresponds to roughly 8 feet of lateral movement. 8 feet of lateral travel in 2 seconds on a forested slope, moving east, away from the direct line between me and Darnell and toward the eastern edge of the parcel where Darnell's position was now closest. It had moved from between me and Darnell to a position between Darnell and the forest edge. I called to Darnell again, and I told him to come back to me directly. Come down the slope now. Straight line. Don't stop. He started moving toward me. Immediately he'd heard something in my voice that he'd recognized as serious, because Darnell knows my field voice, and he knew it was different. He took 10 steps, and he stopped. I was watching him through the instrument eyepiece when it happened. His face was visible at that distance, in the way faces are visible at 60 yards. Not in detail, but in expression. The gross features of expression, readable even without fine resolution. His face went through the sequence I described before. Recognition, the specific expression of a person confirming something real, and then blank. Not frightened, not exactly. Blank. The expression of a nervous system that has received something it cannot process into any category it currently holds. He stood still for 3 seconds. Then he turned east and ran. I called his name. He didn't stop. He went into the forest at the eastern edge of the parcel, between the trunks, and was gone from my sight line in 4 seconds. I was 15 yards from my instrument case on a steep slope, and I had to get to the case before I moved because I was not leaving a $12,000 total station on a forested slope in the Monongahela, and by the time I had the case in my hand and was moving the direction he'd gone, He was already through the tree line, and there was nothing ahead of me but hardwood forest and the dim light of the northeast quadrant and silence. I packed the instrument in 30 seconds, which is fast for a total station in a hard case with the tripod still set, and I moved east into the forest in the direction he'd gone. I was calling his name. I was tracking by sound as much as by sight the specific sound of a person moving fast through hardwood understory is distinct enough to follow when the forest is otherwise quiet. The crack of branches and the thud of footfalls on leaf litter and the pattern of sound that a person in motion produces. I tracked that pattern for maybe 100 yards before it stopped. Not gradually stopped, stopped abruptly, the way a sound stops when the person making it has also stopped. I called his name into the silence and got nothing back. I stood in the northeast quadrant with the instrument case in my hand and listened, and the forest around me was quiet in the way it had been quiet all afternoon. The muffled quality of the dense canopy absorbing rather than reflecting, and there was no sound of Darnell anywhere I could locate. I made a decision in about 10 seconds. I was alone on a steep northeast-facing slope in the Monongahela with a total station that had just documented a 9-foot invisible mass 50 yards from me. And the person who had been with me had run and gone silent, and I was holding a $12,000 instrument case, and I was not going deeper into the northeast quadrant to look for him. I turned south and I moved toward the skid road. I moved as fast as the terrain allowed, which was not fast. The slope was steep, and the leaf litter was deep, and I had the instrument case in one hand and my GPS unit in the other, and I was watching the skid road waypoint on the GPS display, and I was not looking back. I can tell you that clearly I did not look back once between the northeast quadrant and the skid road. Whatever the instrument had documented was behind me, and I had made a decision that I was going to arrive at the truck before I assessed any further decisions. The skid road was 200 yards and a ridge contour away. I covered it in about 6 minutes, which is fast for that terrain with a load, and when I came out of the forest onto the graded surface of the road, I stood still for a moment and breathed and listened. The road stretched south toward the truck. The forest on both sides was quiet. I walked south on the road. Fast walk, not a run. The kind of pace that covers ground without making noise. I needed to hear. The truck was at the far end of the skid road, where we'd parked it, at the Forest Road junction, 400 yards. I covered it in under 5 minutes. Darnell was in the passenger seat. He was sitting upright, hands on his thighs, eyes forward. His door was unlocked and closed. The truck was locked from the inside with the key fob, which was in his vest pocket, which meant he had reached the truck first, unlocked it, gotten in, and locked it again. He was sitting in the exact posture he'd been in when I found him, hands on thighs, eyes forward, completely still, and he was not responding to his name through the window glass. I knocked on the window. He did not look at me. I used the spare key I carry in my pack to unlock the driver's side, and I got in, and I put my hand on his shoulder, and I said his name, and his name, and his name. He did not respond. His eyes were open, and his breathing was normal, and his color was normal, and he was as unreachable as if he were behind a wall rather than beside me in a truck cab. I drove to the hospital in Elkins, 62 miles on mountain roads. He did not speak, and he did not look at me, and he did not make any movement the entire drive. When I parked at the emergency entrance and got out and opened his door, he got out on his own and he walked with me into the building. He has been walking on his own and moving through the world on his own since that day. He simply does not speak. I filed the field notes and instrument log from that day in the contract folder and submitted the survey as incomplete due to a field incident, which I documented as a medical emergency affecting the survey technician. The district surveyor called me to follow up, and I told him Darnell had experienced a medical episode on the slope that required immediate evacuation and that I had been unable to complete the northeast quadrant. He said understood and arranged a follow-up crew. He did not ask what kind of medical episode. I did not explain. I still have the instrument log file from that day on the survey computer in my office. I have not submitted it with the survey record, and I have not deleted it. What it contains is the obstruction data from the northeast quadrant sweep angular position, height estimate, reflectivity signature, movement record. All of it documented in the instrument's own precise and unemotional language. I have reviewed it dozens of times. It says the same thing every time. Something stood at 30 yards on that slope for at least 20 minutes, visible to a precision survey instrument and invisible to two experienced field workers at distances of 30 and 60 yards respectively in clear daytime conditions. The instrument documented its dimensions 8 to 9 feet tall, 2 to 3 feet across. It documented its behavior stationary for 20 minutes, then 8 feet of lateral movement in 2 seconds. It documented the direction of movement east toward Darnell's position. That is what the data shows. That is what the instrument recorded. I do not have a framework within 12 years of field practice that accommodates it, and I have looked for one. Darnell's mother called me in December. She said he had started writing, not speaking writing. She said she wanted me to hear it because she thought I might be the only person who would understand what it meant. She read it to me slowly over the phone, pausing between sentences the way you pause when you are not sure if the words make sense to the person you are reading them to. He had written, "I saw it. It was looking at me. It knew I could see it. I don't think that's why I can't talk. I think I can't talk because of what it looked like when it knew." She asked me if I understood what he meant. I thought about the instrument data. I thought about the 5 minutes the total station spent sweeping across a 9-foot mast that stood 30 yards from me on an open slope in full daylight and registered as invisible to my eyes and to Darnell's. I thought about the moment the mast shifted east, moved in 2 seconds, from the line between me and Darnell to a position between Darnell and the eastern forest edge. I thought about what that shift meant in terms of intent. It had been standing between us, in the line of my instrument, perhaps because the measurement beam was the first indication it had received that it was being observed. When it understood, it had been detected not by eyes, which had failed to see it, but by the instrument it moved. It moved away from my instrument and toward Darnell, toward the person whose eyes were the threat. It had known Darnell could see it from the moment it repositioned, and Darnell had seen it from the moment it repositioned. And whatever he saw on that slope in those few seconds between the repositioning and his run, whatever a 9-foot invisible thing looks like up close when it turns and faces the person whose eyes have found it, is what he has not been able to speak from since. I told his mother yes. I told her I understood what he meant. I told her the instrument had also seen it, and that his account was consistent with what the data recorded. She was quiet for a long time, and then she thanked me. Then she said goodbye. I still have the instrument log file on the survey computer in my office. I have not deleted it, and I have not submitted it with the survey record. What is in that file would not be understood by the Forest Service district staff who would receive it, and would not help Darnell, and would not explain itself to any regulatory body in any terms they have language for. So it sits on the survey computer in a folder labeled September 15 field data, and when I open the folder I can see the obstruction log file, and I do not open it unless I need to confirm that what I remember is what the instrument recorded. It always is. The data does not change. The position, the dimensions, the movement record, all of it consistent across every review. The instrument saw it. The instrument documented it. 12 years of field practice and $12,000 of precision optics, and it documented something that stood on a forested slope in West Virginia in September and was visible to a total station and invisible to the human eye, and that knew the difference. The Cheat Mountain District is still there. The parcel boundary is on record. The forest road is still in use. Other surveyors have worked that district since and will continue to work it. If you survey in the Monongahela or in similar forested terrain in the mid-Appalachian highlands, I am asking you to implement a protocol that I now use on every job, without exception, regardless of terrain or assignment type. Establish a 5-minute verbal check-in with your rod person when they are more than 40 yards up a slope from your instrument position, not 10 minutes. 5. If you miss a check-in for any reason, call them back to your position immediately. Do not wait for the next interval. If your instrument flags an obstruction and you look up and the measurement path appears visually clear, take the instrument reading anyway, run the obstruction sweep, and document the result before you do anything else. Then call your rod person back to you. Do not send them further up the slope while the instrument is showing you something in the path that your eyes cannot confirm. Whatever the instrument sees that your eyes don't is still there. It did not leave because your eyes failed to find it. It is standing in the path, and it is standing still, and it is waiting for your rod person to get close enough that its position no longer matters. Get your technician back to your setup position, get to the forest road, drive out. The survey can be completed on another day by a different crew, with more people and better equipment, and someone who has read this and knows what the obstruction flag means when the slope looks clear. Some surveys have to wait. Darnell's silence is what happens when they don't.